Sometimes the loneliest among us are the ones who give the most. At 55, Eliza Hart had spent 30 years teaching other people's children, while her own dreams gathered dust like forgotten books. One cold March evening, she offered a bowl of stew to a tired stranger outside her schoolhouse. The man called himself Cole and listened as she spoke of her small town's troubles with cattle barons. She saw only kindness in his eyes, never knowing that Cole Walker owned more land than anyone in 3 counties. Over simple food and honest talk, he found something he'd forgotten existed, someone who cared more about his character than his fortune. When morning came, secrets would surface that would change everything. But what happens when the town's most generous soul discovers she's been feeding the very man everyone fears? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun filtered through the dust-caked windows of Walnut Creek's one-room schoolhouse, casting long shadows across the worn wooden floors that had witnessed 3 decades of learning. Eliza Hart stood at the front of the room, her fingers tracing the smooth surface of her teaching slatia, simple piece of black stone that had become as familiar to her touch as her own heartbeat. The slate bore the chalk marks of yesterday's arithmetic lesson, numbers that spoke of practical knowledge, how many bushels of wheat, how many head of cattle, how much money needed to survive another harsh winter on the frontier. At 55, Eliza possessed the kind of understated beauty that comes from years of purposeful living. Her auburn hair, now streaked with silver, was pulled back in a practical bun that had remained unchanged since her arrival in Walnut Creek in 1855. Her grey eyes held the patient wisdom of someone who had guided countless children through their first stumbling attempts at reading, their breakthrough moments when letters suddenly became words, words became sentences, and sentences became the foundation of understanding. The schoolhouse itself reflected both her dedication and the town's modest means. Built from rough-hewn timber and chinked with prairie clay, it stood as a testament to the community's belief that education mattered, even or especially on the frontier. The single room contained 24 desks of varying sizes, each carved with the initials of students who had long since grown into the farmers, shopkeepers, and mothers who now comprised Walnut Creek's adult population. A pot-bellied stove dominated one corner, its chimney pipe snaking up through the roof, with joints that required constant attention during the bitter Wyoming winters. Eliza's own desk sat at the front, its drawers filled with the accumulated treasures of her profession, stub pencils sharpened to their final inch, bottles of ink mixed from berries and soot, and the leather-bound grade book where she recorded not just academic progress but personal observations about each child's character, fears, and dreams. Behind her desk, a small cot folded against the walla, recent addition that spoke to her increasingly precarious financial situation. She had arrived in Walnut Creek as a young woman of 25, fresh from a teacher's college in Boston, carrying letters of recommendation and dreams of civilizing the frontier through education. The town had seemed impossibly small then, just a collection of buildings clustered around a creek that ran clear and cold from the nearby mountains. But Eliza had seen potential in the eager faces of children who walked miles to attend school, in parents who sacrificed precious daylight hours to attend evening literacy classes, in a community that valued learning above almost everything else. 3 decades later, those children had become the backbone of Walnut Creek. Samuel Morrison, who had struggled with his letters at age 7, now ran the town's most successful general store. Mary Catherine O'Brien, once too shy to speak above a whisper, had become the region's most sought-after midwife. Thomas Brennan, who had shown such promise in mathematics, had gone east to study engineering before returning to design the irrigation system that had transformed the valley's agriculture. Yet, for all her professional success, Eliza's personal life remained as spare as her classroom budget. She had received 3 marriage proposals over the year's own, from a fellow teacher, another from a widowed rancher, and a third from the town's doctor. Each time, she had declined with genuine regret but unwavering certainty that her calling lay in education, not domesticity. The children of Walnut Creek were her children, the schoolhouse her home, and the advancement of knowledge her greatest joy. But joy, she had learned, was not the same as happiness. In the quiet hours after her students departed, when the setting sun painted the empty desks in shades of gold and amber, loneliness settled around her like morning mist. She had learned to fill these moments with industry-grading papers, preparing lessons, mending torn books with needle and thread. Yet sometimes, when the wind howled across the prairie with particular force, she wondered what it might have been like to have someone waiting for her at day's end, someone who cared about her thoughts and dreams as much as she cared about theirs. The town itself had grown around her, expanding from its original dozen buildings to nearly 40 structures that housed close to 200 souls. Main Street now boasted Morrison's General Store, Dr. Henley's medical practice, the Silver Dollar Saloon, Peterson's blacksmith shop, and the Cattleman's Hotel, a grand name for a modest establishment that offered clean beds and hot meals to travelers passing through. The residential streets branched out from Main Street like the ribs of a fan, lined with houses that reflected their owners' prosperity and aspirations. Eliza's own living situation had become increasingly precarious. For 25 years, she had boarded with the Hendersons, a kindly couple who had treated her like family. But age and illness had forced them to sell their home and move in with their daughter in Denver, leaving Eliza to find alternative arrangements. The school board had grudgingly agreed to let her sleep in the schoolhouse temporarily, but the arrangement violated county regulations and could not continue indefinitely. More troubling still were the mounting debts that threatened the school's very existence. The territorial government's funding had been cut repeatedly, and the town's contribution had dwindled as agricultural prices fell and drought years became more frequent. The school owed money to the lumber company for repairs, to the coal supplier for winter fuel, and to the book company for the precious texts that formed the foundation of her students' education. Each month brought new bills and fewer resources to pay them. The cattle syndicates had been circling Walnut Creek like vultures for over a year, their representatives making increasingly aggressive offers for the ranch land that surrounded the town. These weren't local ranchers seeking to expand their operations, but Eastern investors who saw the frontier as nothing more than a source of profit. They spoke of efficiency and consolidation, of eliminating small operations in favor of massive ranches that could ship beef to Chicago and New York. What they didn't speak of was the human cost, the families who would be displaced, the community bonds that would be severed, the way of life that would disappear forever. Eliza had seen their influence growing in subtle ways. The bank had become less generous with credit extensions. The territorial representatives had become less responsive to the town's concerns. Even some of her own students had begun to speak of leaving, their parents convinced that the future lay in the growing cities rather than the dying frontier. It was against this backdrop of mounting challenges that Cole Walker had appeared, though she knew him only by his first name and the quiet dignity with which he carried himself. He had arrived 3 days earlier, riding a horse that spoke of quality despite its travel-worn appearance. His clothes were plain but well-made, and his hands bore the calluses of a working man, though there was something in his bearing that suggested he was accustomed to command. When she had first offered him food, it had been an impulse born of Christian charity and frontier hospitality. A stranger in need was a stranger to be helped, regardless of his ability to pay. But as they had shared meals and conversation over the past 3 evenings, she had found herself looking forward to his company with an anticipation that surprised her. He listened with genuine interest to her concerns about the town's future, asked thoughtful questions about her teaching methods, and spoke with quiet authority about matters ranging from literature to livestock management. There was something comforting about his presence, a sense of strength and stability that she had not experienced in years. He seemed to understand the weight of responsibility she carried, the way caring for others could become both a source of purpose and a burden. When he spoke of his own travels, she heard echoes of loneliness that matched her own. though he was careful never to reveal too much about his past or his circumstances. Last evening, as they had shared the simple meal of bread and preserved peaches, he had asked about her dreams for the school's future. The question had caught her off guard, for it had been years since anyone had shown interest in her aspirations rather than her immediate needs. She had found herself speaking of the library she hoped to build, the science equipment she longed to purchase, the advanced courses she dreamed of offering to students who showed exceptional promise. "Knowledge is power," she had said, unconsciously echoing the words that had inspired her to become a teacher. But more than that, it's freedom. Every child who learns to read and write and think critically becomes a little more free, a little more able to shape their own destiny. Cole had nodded thoughtfully, his eyes reflecting the lamplight as he considered her words. "And what about your own freedom, Miss Hart? What would you do if you could shape your own destiny without regard for anyone else's needs?" The question had struck her silent for a long moment. It had been so long since she had considered her own wants apart from her duties that she hardly knew how to answer. Finally, she had said, "I suppose I would want to matter, Mr. Cole, to know that my life had made a difference, that the world was a little better because I had been in it." He had smiled then, an expression that transformed his somewhat austere features into something warmer, more approachable. "I think you can rest assured on that account, Miss Hart. The world is definitely better for having you in it." Now, as she prepared for another day of teaching, Eliza found herself wondering about the man who had brought such unexpected comfort into her life. There was something about him that didn't quite fit the image of a traveling cowhand or drifter. His speech was too educated, his manners too refined, his understanding of business and politics too sophisticated. Yet he seemed genuinely interested in the concerns of a small frontier town, and his presence had brought her a sense of peace she had not felt in years. The sound of approaching footsteps on the wooden walkway outside drew her attention back to the present moment. Her students would arrive soon, ready for another day of learning, and she needed to prepare herself for the challenges that lay ahead. But as she picked up her chalk and began writing the day's lessons on the blackboard, she found herself hoping that Cole would still be in town when school dismissed, that there would be another evening of quiet conversation and shared understanding waiting for her at the day's end. She had no way of knowing that the man she had welcomed so warmly into her life possessed the power to solve all her problems with a single decision, that his presence in Walnut Creek would force her to confront everything she thought she knew about wealth, power, and the true meaning of love. The envelope arrived with the morning mail, delivered by young Timothy Patterson, who rode the mail route between Walnut Creek and the county seat. Eliza recognized the official seal immediately. The Territorial Education Office rarely sent correspondence unless the news was dire. Her hands trembled slightly as she broke the wax seal, though she tried to maintain her composure in front of the students who were arriving for the day's lessons. The words on the paper seemed to swim before her eyes as their meaning became clear. Due to outstanding debts totaling $347 and the failure to meet territorial education standards regarding adequate housing for the instructor, the Walnut Creek School was hereby ordered to cease operations effective immediately. All educational materials were to be surrendered to the territorial authorities for redistribution to schools in better financial standing. The building itself would be sold at public auction to satisfy the outstanding debts. The foreclosure notice fell from her nerveless fingers, floating to the floor like an autumn leaf. 30 years of dedicated service, 30 years of nurturing young minds and building futures, reduced to a legal document that could fit in an envelope. She stood frozen in the morning sunlight, unable to process the magnitude of what she had just read. "Miss Hart?" The voice belonged to little Sarah Caldwell, age 7, who had just mastered the art of reading simple sentences. "Are you feeling poorly?" Eliza forced herself to smile, though it felt like her face might crack from the effort. "I'm fine, dear. Please take your seat. We'll begin with reading in just a moment." But she wasn't fine. As her students settled into their desks, chattering about their morning chores and weekend adventures, Eliza felt as though the ground beneath her feet had suddenly given way. The school wasn't just her workplace, it was her entire world. These children weren't just her students, they were her legacy, her purpose, her reason for being. How could she tell them that their education was ending? How could she explain that grown-ups with ledger books and legal documents had decided their learning wasn't worth the cost? How could she face their parents, many of whom had sacrificed to ensure their children could attend school? The morning passed in a blur of mechanical instruction. She heard herself teaching spelling and arithmetic, but her mind was elsewhere, frantically searching for solutions that didn't exist. By the time she dismissed the children for their noon meal, exhaustion had settled over her like a heavy blanket. She was sitting at her desk, staring at the foreclosure notice and fighting back tears, when she heard familiar footsteps on the wooden walkway outside. Cole appeared in the doorway, his hat in his hands and concern written across his weathered features. "Miss Hart, Timothy Patterson mentioned you seemed upset when he delivered the mail. I hope you don't mind my checking on you." The kindness in his voice was nearly her undoing. She looked up at him, this man who had become such an unexpected source of comfort, and felt her carefully maintained composure begin to crumble. "The school is being closed," she said simply, holding up the official notice. "I've been ordered to cease operations immediately. Everything I've worked for, everything these children need, it's all ending." Cole stepped into the room, closing the door behind him. His expression had grown serious, and she noticed how his jaw tightened as he processed her words. Without asking permission, he took the notice from her hands and read it carefully, his eyes moving over the legal language with a familiarity that surprised her. "This is unconscionable," he said after a long moment. "A debt of $347? That's barely the price of a good horse." "It might as well be 3,047, Eliza replied bitterly. "I don't have it. The town doesn't have it. The territorial government has made it clear they won't provide additional funding." She stood and walked to the window, looking out at the street where some of her students were playing during their lunch break. "These children will have no school, Mr. Cole. Their chance at education, at a better life, is disappearing because of money." She felt rather than heard him approach behind her. When he spoke, his voice was low and controlled, but she could hear the anger simmering beneath the surface. "Who makes these decisions? Who has the authority to destroy a child's future over such a pittance?" "The Territorial Education Board, working with the county commissioners." She turned to face him, surprised by the intensity of his expression. "They're all in the pocket of the cattle syndicates, of course, men who see education as a waste of resources that could be better spent on beef production. They want the children working on ranches, not learning to read and think for themselves." Cole was quiet for a long moment, studying the foreclosure notice again. When he looked up, there was something different in his eyes, a hardness she hadn't seen before. "This Jeremiah Hutchins," he said, pointing to a signature at the bottom of the document. "He's the territorial commissioner who signed this order." "Yes, he's been the driving force behind the school closures throughout the territory. Claims it's about fiscal responsibility, but everyone knows he's working with Eastern investors who want to consolidate land holdings." Eliza felt a surge of anger at the mention of Hutchins' name. He's never met these children, never seen what education means to them and their families. To him, they're just obstacles to profit. And this debt, though, did it accumulate? Eliza explained the series of budget cuts and unexpected expenses that had gradually overwhelmed the school's resources. The harsh winter that had required extra coal for heating, the roof repairs after a summer hailstorm, the textbooks that had been ordered before the territorial funding was cut. Each expense had been necessary, justified, and modest, but together they had created an insurmountable burden. "I've tried everything," she concluded. "I've written letters to Eastern philanthropists, appealed to church organizations, even considered taking out a personal loan. But no bank will lend money to a woman, especially one without collateral. I've been sleeping here because I can't afford separate lodging, but even that violates regulations and gives them another excuse to shut us down." Cole folded the notice carefully and handed it back to her. What would it take to save the school, not just pay the debt, but ensure its future stability? The question surprised her. It seemed like mere curiosity. What could a traveling cowhand do about territorial politics and educational funding? But his tone suggested genuine interest in her answer. Money, of course, but more than that. The territorial authorities would need to be convinced that closing the school serves no one's interests. The local community would need to demonstrate unified support, and somehow the influence of the cattle syndicates would need to be countered. She shook her head sadly. It would take someone with significant political connections and financial resources, someone the territorial commissioners couldn't ignore or intimidate. Someone like a major landowner or cattle baron. Exactly like that, but every major rancher in the territory is either part of the syndicate or afraid to oppose them. The independent operators are being squeezed out or bought out. Eliza managed a rueful smile. I don't suppose you know any wealthy cattle barons who might be interested in supporting education. For a moment, something flickered across Cole's Facian expression she couldn't quite interpret. Then he smiled, though it seemed somewhat forced. I'm afraid my acquaintance with cattle barons is limited, he said. But don't give up hope, Miss Hart. Sometimes help comes from unexpected quarters. The afternoon passed quietly, with Cole remaining nearby, as Eliza struggled through her regular lessons, while grappling with the knowledge that each one might be among the last she would ever teach. When the children departed for the day, several of them lingered to ask about rumors they had heard regarding the school's future. She managed to reassure them without outright lying, but the effort left her emotionally drained. As evening approached and Cole helped her tidy the classroom, she found herself studying his profile in the lamplight. There was something about his reaction to the foreclosure notice that nagged at her, familiarity with legal documents and political processes that seemed unusual for a man of his apparent station. When he had mentioned cattle barons, his tone had carried a knowledge that went beyond casual observation. Mr. Cole, she said as they finished their work, may I ask what you did before you took to traveling? You seem quite knowledgeable about business and legal matters. He paused in his task of stacking textbooks, and she saw that flicker of something across his features again. I've had various occupations over the years, he said carefully. A man learns many things when he spent time in different places, around different kinds of people. It wasn't really an answer, but Eliza sensed that pressing for more details would be unwelcome. Instead, she nodded and returned to her own work, though she couldn't shake the feeling that Cole Walker was far more than he appeared to be. As they shared another simple meal together, she found herself clinging to his steady presence, even as her world crumbled around her. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and difficult conversations with parents and community leaders. But tonight, at least, she wasn't facing the crisis alone. She had no way of knowing that the man sharing her humble supper possessed the power to solve her problems with a single word, or that his presence in her life was about to become far more complicated than either of them could imagine. Cole's leather saddlebags sat in the corner of the hotel room, their worn exterior belying the importance of their contents. Inside, carefully wrapped in oiled cloth, lay documents that would have astonished anyone in Walnut Creek who took the time to examine them. Bank drafts from Denver and Chicago, correspondence from cattle buyers in Kansas City, legal papers establishing ownership of ranches spanning 3 territories. And at the bottom, a small leather portfolio containing the registration for the Walker Brander, simple W, enclosed in a circle that marked cattle on ranges from Wyoming to Texas. Cole stood at the window of his modest room at the Cattleman's Hotel, watching the morning activity on Main Street, while wrestling with a decision that grew more difficult each day. 3 days ago, maintaining his disguise had seemed simple enough. He had come to Walnut Creek to assess the town's potential as a shipping point for his cattle operations, planning to spend a few days observing before revealing his identity and conducting business. It was a routine he had followed in dozens of frontier towns, and it had always proved efficient and profitable. But nothing about Walnut Creek was proving routine. The schoolteacher who had offered him food and kindness had changed everything. Each conversation with Eliza Hart revealed new depths of character, new reasons to admire her dedication and strength. Her crisis with the school had awakened protective instincts he hadn't felt in years, while her obvious intelligence and dignity made him realize how hungry he had been for genuine conversation with someone who valued substance over status. The irony wasn't lost on him. Here was a woman fighting against the very forces he represented: large-scale cattle operations, territorial politics, the inexorable march of Eastern capital across the frontier. Yet she was also everything he had been searching for without knowing it. Someone who saw beyond wealth and position to the man beneath. Someone whose own worth was measured in service rather than profit. He pulled on his plain wool coat and headed downstairs, nodding to Mrs. Patterson, who ran the hotel's small dining room. She had been curious about his extended stay, but frontier courtesy prevented direct questions about a guest's business. He ordered coffee and biscuits, listening to the conversations around him as the town's early risers discussed their plans for the day. "Shame about the school," said Dr. Henley to Samuel Morrison. "Miss Hart's beside herself, though she's trying not to show it. Been the best teacher this town's ever had." "Could use the building for storage once she's gone," Morrison replied pragmatically. "Lord knows I need the space for the spring shipments. Though I suppose the children will have to go without schooling until the territorial authorities figure out what to do next." "Might not be any next," said Tom Brennan, joining the conversation. "Word is they're planning to consolidate all the smaller schools into larger operations in the county seats. Children would have to board away from home if they wanted education past the basics." Cole forced himself to remain still, though every instinct urged him to reveal his identity and offer immediate assistance. A few words from Cole Walker would solve Eliza's problems instantly. His wealth and influence in territorial politics were legendary, and no bureaucrat would dare ignore his direct intervention. But revealing himself now would shatter the trust he had been building with Eliza, and he wasn't ready to face the inevitable questions about his motivations and identity. Instead, he finished his breakfast and walked toward the schoolhouse, where he had taken to spending part of each day helping with minor repairs and maintenance. It gave him a chance to observe Eliza in her element while contributing something useful to her efforts. More importantly, it allowed him to learn about the town's actual needs and problems rather than the sanitized version he would receive in formal business meetings. He found her standing in front of the building, staring at a notice that had been nailed to the door during the night. Even from a distance, he could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she held herself, as if bracing against a physical blow. "Another communication from the territorial authorities?" he asked gently as he approached. She turned to him with eyes that showed she had been crying, though her voice remained steady. "They're conducting an inspection tomorrow. If the school fails to meet their standards, which it certainly will, given that I'm living here illegally, they'll proceed with immediate closure. No appeal, no grace period." Cole read the notice over her shoulder, noting the official seals and signatures. The inspection was being conducted by a team that included Jeremiah Hutchins himself, along with 2 territorial commissioners Cole recognized as men firmly in the pocket of the Eastern cattle syndicates. It was, he realized, a coordinated effort to eliminate obstacles to large-scale land consolidation. "What standards are they likely to enforce?" he asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Everything from proper teacher certification to adequate facilities to compliance with health and safety regulations." Eliza's voice carried a note of bitter humor. "Standards that would be reasonable if they were applied fairly, but which become impossible when they're designed to exclude rather than include." She unlocked the schoolhouse door, and they went inside together. Cole had grown familiar with the room over the past few days, noting its obvious limitations, as well as its careful organization and the evidence of Eliza's dedication. The building was old and showed its age, but it was clean, well-maintained, and clearly loved. More importantly, it was producing educated children who would otherwise have no access to learning. "Miss Hart," he said carefully, "what if there were resources available to bring the school into compliance? What would it actually take to meet their standards?" She looked at him with surprise. "Mr. Cole, I appreciate your concern, but we've already established that the community lacks the financial means." "Hypothetically," he interrupted, "if money weren't an issue, what would need to be done?" For a moment, hope flickered in her eyes before pragmatism reasserted itself. A separate residence for the teacher would be essential. Some repairs to the roof and windows. New textbooks to replace the ones that are falling apart. Perhaps most importantly, documentation that the teacher meets territorial certification requirements, which means traveling to the capital for examination and registration. Cole nodded thoughtfully. Each item on her list was entirely reasonable and relatively inexpensive by his standards. The total cost would be less than he typically spent on a single business dinner in Denver. Yet for this community, it represented an insurmountable obstacle. And politically, what would it take to ensure the inspection was conducted fairly? Eliza's expression grew troubled. That's the real challenge. The inspectors aren't coming here to evaluate the school objectively. They're coming to justify a decision that's already been made. It would take intervention from someone with significant influence in territorial politics, someone the commissioners couldn't afford to ignore or antagonize. Someone like a major cattle owner? Exactly. But as I mentioned yesterday, every significant rancher in the territory is either part of the syndicate or afraid to oppose them. She managed a rueful smile. It would take someone with the kind of wealth and influence that comes from owning vast amounts of land, someone whose operations are so large that the territorial authorities depend on their support. Cole turned away to examine a student's arithmetic work posted on the wall, using the moment to compose his features. The conversation was becoming increasingly uncomfortable, forcing him to confront the deception he was maintaining. Every word Eliza spoke made it clearer that he possessed exactly the resources and influence needed to solve her problems, yet revealing that fact would fundamentally change their relationship. "Mr. Cole." Eliza's voice carried a note of concern. "You seem troubled by something. I hope I haven't burdened you too much with my problems." He turned back to her, struck once again by her consideration for others, even in the midst of her own crisis. "Not at all, Miss Hart. I was simply thinking about the injustice of the situation. Good work deserves support, and from what I've observed, your work here is exceptional." The compliment brought a flush to her cheeks, and Cole felt his resolve to maintain his disguise wavering. How much longer could he continue this charade when every instinct urged him to help? Yet how could he reveal his identity without destroying the trust and respect that had grown between them? As they worked together to prepare for what might be the school's final day of operation, Cole found himself studying Eliza's face, memorizing the determined set of her jaw and the gentle patience she showed with each student. Tomorrow would bring the inspection that would likely end her career in Walnut Creek, and he was running out of time to decide how far he was willing to go to protect what had become precious to him. The weight of his concealed identity pressed down on him like a physical burden, made heavier by the knowledge that with each passing hour, the woman he was coming to care for was moving closer to losing everything that mattered to her. The evening light filtered through the schoolhouse windows, casting a golden glow across the pages of Eliza's mother's Bible as she carefully turned to a passage marked with a pressed wildflower. The flower, a delicate purple lupinide, been placed there 20 years ago during one of her few visits home to Massachusetts. Her mother had picked it from the garden behind their modest house, pressing it between the pages of Ecclesiastes with words that had stayed with Eliza ever since. "For everything there is a season, dear one, and perhaps your season of solitude is preparing you for something beautiful." Cole sat across from her at the small table where they had taken to sharing their evening meals, watching as she traced the faded petals with one finger. The simple intimacy of the moment, the shared silence, the lamplight, the sense of two souls finding comfort in each other's presence, struck him with unexpected force. He had dined in the finest restaurants from San Francisco to New York, surrounded by society's elite, yet he had never felt the profound contentment that came from sitting in this humble room with this remarkable woman. "My mother gave me this Bible when I left Boston," Eliza said softly, her voice carrying the weight of memory. She was terrified that I was throwing my life away, coming west to teach frontier children. "What about marriage, Eliza?" she asked. "What about children of your own?" I told her that perhaps God had called me to a different kind of motherhood. She looked up at Cole, her grey eyes reflecting the lamp's warm light. "I've never regretted that decision, not truly, but I sometimes wonder what she would think of the woman I've become, whether she would be proud of the choices I've made." Cole found his voice carefully. "From what you've told me about your work here, about the lives you've touched and the futures you've shaped, I believe any mother would be proud beyond words." "You're kind to say so." Eliza closed the Bible gently, her fingers lingering on its worn leather cover. "Tell me about your family, Mr. Cole. Surely there are people somewhere who worry about your wandering ways." The question hit him like a physical blow, forcing him to confront truths he had been avoiding for years. His parents were long dead, victims of cholera during his youth. His brother had been killed in the war between the states, leaving Cole as the sole heir to lands and wealth that had grown beyond anything his family could have imagined. There were business associates who depended on his decisions, employees whose livelihoods rested on his success, but no one who knew him as simply Cole rather than Cole Walker, cattle baron and territorial power broker. "I'm afraid I'm rather alone in the world," he said, the honesty of the statement surprising him. "My parents died when I was young, and I never—" He paused, realizing he was about to reveal more than was wise. "I never found the right person to build a family with. Never found the right person, or never took the time to look." Eliza's question was gentle but perceptive. "In my experience, men who wander as much as you do are often running from something rather than toward it." Cole felt heat rise in his cheeks. Her insight was uncomfortable in its accuracy. He had indeed been running from the isolation that came with wealth, from the constant awareness that people sought his company for what he could provide rather than who he was, from the growing certainty that his success had cost him any chance at genuine human connection. "Perhaps you're right," he admitted, "though I prefer to think of it as searching rather than running." "And what are you searching for?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with possibility. Cole found himself studying her face in the lamplight, noting the intelligence in her eyes, the strength in the line of her jaw, the compassion that seemed to radiate from her very being. How could he explain that he was searching for exactly what he had found in this humble schoolhouse? Someone who saw value in service rather than acquisition, who measured worth in contribution rather than accumulation, who had built a life of meaning rather than mere success. "I suppose I'm searching for a place where I matter," he said finally, "not for what I can provide or what I own, but for who I am as a man." Eliza nodded slowly, as if his answer confirmed something she had suspected. "It's a lonely thing, isn't it? To be valued only for what you can give, rather than who you are." Her words struck him with the force of recognition. She understood, somehow, the particular kind of isolation that came from being needed rather than wanted, valued rather than loved. Yet how could she understand when her circumstances were so different from his own? "You speak as if you know something about that kind of loneliness," he said carefully. "Don't I?" Eliza's smile was sad but knowing. "I've spent 30 years being valued for my usefulness to this community. They respect my education, appreciate my dedication, depend on my services. But respect and appreciation aren't the same as friendship, and dependence isn't the same as love. I matter to them as their teacher, but I sometimes wonder if I matter to anyone as simply Eliza." The parallel between their situations struck Cole with stunning clarity. Here they sat, two people isolated by the very roles that defined them, she by her position as the indispensable teacher, he by his wealth and power. Both valued for what they provided rather than who they were, both starving for connection that transcended utility. "Perhaps," he said quietly, "we matter to each other." The words hung between them, laden with meaning that went far beyond casual friendship. Eliza's breath caught slightly, and Cole saw something shift in her expressiona, recognition of the deeper current that had been flowing beneath their conversations. "Mr. Cole," she began, then stopped, uncertainty flickering across her features. Yes? I find myself hoping you'll choose to stay in Walnut Creek, at least for a while longer. I know you must have business elsewhere, obligations that call you away, but—" She paused, gathering her courage. "I would miss our conversations terribly." Cole felt his heart racing. The simple admission meant more to him than any business triumph or financial success he had ever achieved. Here was someone who wanted his company for its own sake, who valued his thoughts and presence rather than his resources and influence. "I would miss them too," he said, meaning every word, "more than I can properly express." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. Outside, the sounds of evening settled over Walnut Creek horses moving in the livery stable, the distant laughter from the saloon, the gentle creak of wooden buildings settling in the cooling air. Inside the schoolhouse, the lamp flame flickered slightly, casting dancing shadows across the walls lined with children's artwork and educational charts. "Miss Hart," Cole said eventually, "whatever happens with the school inspection tomorrow, I want you to know that your work here has made a difference. I've seen it in the way people speak of you, in the quality of the children you've taught, in the respect and affection the entire community holds for you." "Thank you," she whispered, and he could see tears gathering in her eyes. "That means more to me than you know." As they prepared to part for the evening, Cole found himself fighting the urge to reveal everything: his identity, his resources, his growing feelings for her. The words pressed against his lips with almost physical force, but he held them back. Tomorrow would bring the inspection that could destroy her world, and he still hadn't decided how much of himself he was willing to reveal to prevent that destruction. What he did know was that the woman sitting across from him had become more important to him than any business deal or territorial acquisition. Whatever happened tomorrow, whatever the cost to his carefully maintained anonymity, he would not stand by and watch Eliza Hart lose everything she had worked to build. The time for deception was coming to an end, whether he was ready or not. The yellowed document Cole discovered in the hotel's small library was hidden beneath a stack of old territorial newspapers, its edges brittle with age, but its contents remarkably preserved. The original charter for Walnut Creek, dated 1847, contained provisions that made his pulse quicken with possibility. According to the founding document, the town had been granted special status as an educational settlement, with explicit protections for its school and requirements that any territorial actions affecting education must be approved by a majority of resident property owners. Cole read the charter 3 times, his legal training from years of business dealings helping him parse the archaic language. If the document was legitimate and the official seals suggested it was, then the territorial authorities had no right to close the school without community consent. More importantly, the charter granted the town certain self-governance privileges that could be used to resist outside pressure from cattle syndicates and their political allies. He was still studying the document when Mrs. Patterson approached with a pot of coffee and a worried expression. "Mr. Cole, I hope you don't mind my saying so, but you seem quite interested in our town's affairs for a man just passing through." Her observation was pointed but not unfriendly. Cole looked up from the charter, realizing he had been so absorbed in his discovery that he had forgotten to maintain his casual traveler facade. "I've grown fond of Walnut Creek during my stay," he said carefully. "It seems wrong that outside forces should dictate the fate of such a close-knit community." "Miss Hart's been good to this town," Mrs. Patterson continued, settling into a chair across from him. "Taught my Timothy to read, helped him with his arithmetic when he was struggling. She's done that for near every family here, one way or another. Seems a shame to lose her over money troubles." Cole nodded, then made a decision that felt both necessary and dangerous. "Mrs. Patterson, what would you say if I told you there might be legal grounds to challenge the school closure?" Her eyes widened with surprise and cautious hope. "Legal grounds? What kind of legal grounds?" He showed her the charter, explaining its provisions in simple terms. As he spoke, he watched her expression transform from skepticism to excitement to determination. You mean they can't just shut us down? We have rights under this old paper. If the charter is still valid, yes, but it would require the community to stand together and assert those rights, and it would mean challenging some very powerful interests. Mrs. Patterson's jaw set with the kind of frontier stubbornness that had built the West. Mr. Cole, if there's a legal way to save our school, this town will fight. You can count on that. Word of the charter's discovery spread through Walnut Creek like wildfire. By evening, nearly 30 adults had gathered in the schoolhouse to hear Cole explain the document's implications. He found himself the center of attention in a way that made him deeply uncomfortable, fielding questions about legal procedures and constitutional law with knowledge that far exceeded what a simple traveler should possess. Eliza watched him from across the room, her expression thoughtful and increasingly puzzled. When Dr. W. Henley asked about the specific legal precedents that might apply, Cole's answer was so detailed and authoritative that several people exchanged glances. When Samuel Morrison inquired about the territorial court system's hierarchy, Cole's response revealed intimate knowledge of judicial procedures that went far beyond casual observation. "Mr. Cole," said Tom Brennan after Cole had finished explaining the potential for an injunction, "you seem remarkably well versed in territorial law for a cowhand." The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. Cole felt the weight of 24 pairs of eyes studying him, searching for answers to questions they were only beginning to formulate. Eliza's gaze was particularly intense, and he could see her putting together pieces of a puzzle she hadn't known she was solving. "A man picks up knowledge in his travels," Cole said evenly. "I've seen similar situations in other territories, heard lawyers discuss such matters." It was a weak explanation, and he could see that several people weren't satisfied with it. But frontier courtesy prevented them from pressing too hard, especially when he was offering hope for their children's future. The meeting continued late into the evening, with plans emerging for presenting the charter to the territorial inspectors and organizing community resistance to the school closure. Cole found himself appointed to a committee that would draft the legal response, a role that would require him to work closely with the town's leaders while maintaining his increasingly precarious disguise. As the crowd dispersed, Eliza approached him with a mixture of gratitude and concern in her expression. "Mr. Cole, I don't know how to thank you for what you've done tonight. Finding that charter, explaining our options, you've given us hope when I thought all was lost." "I'm glad I could help," he said, meaning it completely while dreading the questions he could see forming in her mind. "May I ask you something?" His heart sank, but he nodded. "Where did you study law? Your knowledge of legal procedures is quite extensive for someone who learned it casually." Cole felt the walls closing in around his deception. Every answer he gave seemed to require another lie, and each lie moved him further from the honest connection he valued so highly with Eliza. "I've had various experiences," he said carefully. "Not all of them involved cattle and horses." It wasn't exactly a lie, but it wasn't the truth either. Eliza studied his face in the lamplight, and he could see her intelligence working to reconcile the man she thought she knew with the evidence of capabilities he couldn't fully hide. "Mr. Cole, I get the feeling you're not quite who you appear to be." The statement was gentle but direct, and Cole felt a moment of panic. How much had she guessed? How much more could he conceal without outright lies that would destroy any possibility of trust between them? "None of us are quite who we appear to be, Miss Hart. We all have aspects of ourselves that we keep private." "Yes, but most of us don't have the kind of legal knowledge that could save a school or the familiarity with territorial politics that you've displayed tonight." She moved closer, her voice dropping to a whisper that wouldn't carry to the few remaining people in the schoolhouse. "I'm grateful for your help, more grateful than you know, but I'm also concerned about what it might cost you to get involved in our fight. These cattle syndicates don't hesitate to destroy people who oppose them, and you've made yourself quite visible tonight." The irony of her concern struck Cole with painful force. She was worried about protecting him from the very forces he commanded, trying to shield him from consequences he could eliminate with a single word. Her kindness and consideration made his deception feel like a betrayal of everything decent between them. "I appreciate your concern," he said softly, "but some things are worth the risk." "Are they? You barely know us, Mr. Cole. Why would you put yourself in danger for a town you stumbled into by accident?" "Because it's not an accident anymore," he thought. "Because somewhere between sharing simple meals and watching you work with those children, this place stopped being a business opportunity and became something much more important." "Perhaps," he said aloud, "because I've found something here worth fighting for." The words carried more weight than he had intended, and he saw recognition flicker in her eyes. For a moment, the air between them seemed charged with possibility and danger in equal measure. Then the moment passed, and practical concerns reasserted themselves. Tomorrow would bring the territorial inspectors and the most important test of their newfound legal strategy. Whatever personal revelations lay ahead would have to wait until they had secured the school's future. But as Cole walked back to his hotel room, he knew that time was running out for his deception. The legal battle they were planning would require more resources and influence than a simple traveler could provide, and Eliza's growing suspicions would soon demand answers he wasn't sure he was ready to give. The faded photograph fell from the pages of a business ledger Cole had been reviewing, fluttering to the floor of his hotel room like a guilty secret finally exposed. The image, taken 5 years earlier at a Cattle Barons Association meeting in Denver, showed a younger Cole surrounded by the territory's most powerful ranchers and their elegant wives. He wore a tailored suit that cost more than most families earned in a year, and his confident smile spoke of a man accustomed to command and deference. Cole picked up the photograph with trembling fingers, staring at the stranger he had been before Walnut Creek changed everything. In the image, he stood next to Jeremiah Hutchins himself, the very man who was coming to inspect the school. They were shaking hands over some forgotten business deal, both men radiating the casual arrogance of those who shaped policy through wealth rather than principle. A knock at his door made him startle, and he quickly slipped the photograph back into the ledger. When he opened the door, he found Timothy Patterson standing in the hallway, his young face flushed with excitement and worry. "Mr. Cole, sir, my ma sent me to fetch you. There's a man downstairs asking questions about you, and she thought you should know." Cole's blood ran cold. What kind of man? What kind of questions? "Well-dressed fellow with a fancy horse. He's been asking around town about strangers, particularly anyone who might be traveling under an assumed name. Ma heard him talking to Mr. Morrison about guests at the hotel." The boy's words confirmed Cole's worst fears. His presence in Walnut Creek had been discovered, probably by someone connected to the cattle syndicate or the territorial government. The legal challenge they were planning had attracted attention from exactly the wrong people. "Thank you for the warning, Timothy. Did this man give his name?" "Called himself Garrett, said he was a private investigator working for some business interests in Cheyenne." Cole recognized the name immediately. Marcus Garrett was a man who specialized in gathering information for wealthy clients, someone who wouldn't hesitate to use whatever he discovered for maximum advantage. If Garrett was in Walnut Creek, it meant Cole's enemies had learned of his presence and were preparing to use it against him. He followed Timothy downstairs, his mind racing through possibilities and consequences. In the hotel's small lobby, he spotted Garrett immediately, thin man in an expensive coat, examining the guest register with the focused attention of a predator studying tracks. Their eyes met across the room, and Cole saw recognition flicker in Garrett's expression before the man's face settled into a cold smile. Well, Cole Walker, as I live and breathe, though I understand you've been going by just Cole lately." The words carried across the lobby, and Cole was aware of Mrs. Patterson and several other townspeople turning to stare. The name Walker clearly meant something to them, though he could see they were still processing the implications. "Mr. Garrett," Cole replied evenly. "I wasn't aware you had business in Walnut Creek." "Oh, my business follows wherever interesting things are happening, and I understand some very interesting things are happening here. A territorial school inspection, legal challenges to established authority, community organizing against powerful interests." Garrett's smile widened. The kind of things that might interest certain parties in the territorial capital. Cole felt the trap closing around him. Garrett wasn't just gathering information, he was preparing to expose Cole's involvement in the school's defense, which would destroy both his carefully maintained anonymity and the town's legal strategy. "I'm sure I don't know what you mean," Cole said carefully. "Don't you? Because I have it on good authority that a certain cattle baron has been playing at being a common traveler, involving himself in local politics, and stirring up trouble for legitimate business interests." Garrett pulled out a small notebook and made a show of consulting it. "The same cattle baron who owns more land in this territory than any other individual, who has significant influence with territorial authorities, and who could solve this little school crisis with a single telegram if he chose to." The words hit the lobby like a thunderbolt. Cole heard Mrs. Patterson's sharp intake of breath, saw Dr. Henley's eyes widen with shock, felt the weight of sudden scrutiny from everyone present. But it was the look on Eliza's face, visible through the schoolhouse window across the street, that truly broke his heart. She had obviously heard Garrett's pronouncement, and the betrayal and confusion in her expression cut him deeper than any physical wound. "Interesting situation," Garrett continued, clearly enjoying the drama he had created. "A man with the power to save these people's school, pretending to be powerless while watching them struggle. Makes one wonder about his true motivations, doesn't it?" Cole's hands clenched into fists, but he forced himself to remain calm. Losing his temper would only make the situation worse, and he needed to think clearly about how to protect both himself and the people who had come to trust him. "Mr. Garrett, if you have something to say it plainly." "Very well, Cole Walker, owner of the Walker Ranch Empire, holder of government contracts worth millions, political ally of the very territorial commissioners who are coming to close this school. What are you really doing in Walnut Creek?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. Cole was aware that word of this confrontation would spread through the town within minutes, that everything he had built with these people was crumbling around him. More importantly, he knew that Eliza was probably listening to every word, learning that the man she had grown to trust was exactly the kind of powerful, deceptive figure she had reason to fear and resent. "My reasons are my own," Cole said finally. "Are they? Because it occurs to me that a man in your position might have all sorts of reasons for involving himself in local affairs. Business reasons, political reasons. Reasons that have nothing to do with genuine concern for frontier education." Garrett snapped his notebook shut with a sound like a gunshot. "I'll be staying in town for a few days, Mr. Walker. I'm sure we'll have more opportunities to chat about your philanthropic interests." With that, he turned and walked out of the hotel, leaving Cole standing in a lobby full of shocked and suspicious faces. The damage was done, his secret exposed in the most damaging way possible. Worse still, he could see through the window that Eliza was walking quickly toward the hotel, her face set in lines of anger and disappointment that made his chest tighten with dread. The conversation he had been dreading was about to happen, and he had no idea how to explain actions that seemed inexplicable even to himself. How could he make her understand that he had started this deception for business reasons, but continued it for entirely personal ones? How could he convince her that his feelings for her were genuine when everything else about his presence in Walnut Creek had been built on lies? The hotel door opened, and Eliza stepped inside. Her grey eyes were bright with unshed tears, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of complete disillusionment. "Mr. Walker, I believe we need to talk." The cattle brand registration document lay spread across the hotel room's small table like evidence at a trial. The official territorial seal glowed in the lamplight, and the signature at the bottom, Cole Walker, in bold, confident strokes, seemed to burn itself into Eliza's vision. She had asked to see proof of his identity, and he had provided it without hesitation, though the cost of that honesty was written in the deep lines of regret that had appeared around his eyes. "The Walker Ranch," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. 60,000 acres spanning 3 territories, government contracts for beef supply to military posts. Political influence that reaches all the way to Washington. She looked up at him, and Cole saw his own anguish reflected in her grey eyes. You're not just wealthy, Mr. Walker. You're one of them, one of the cattle barons we've been fighting against. Cole sat across from her, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. The simple clothes he had worn to maintain his disguise now felt like a costume, a mockery of the honest connection he had tried to build with her. Yes, he said simply, I am. How long? The question came out sharp and brittle. How long have you known who I was, what we were facing? How long have you been sitting there listening to me, worry about problems you could solve with a telegram? The pain in her voice was worse than any physical blow he had ever endured. Cole forced himself to meet her gaze, knowing he owed her complete honesty, regardless of the consequences. I've known from the beginning that I had the resources to help. The political connections, the financial means, all of it. He paused, searching for words that might somehow convey the complexity of his situation. But I didn't know you from the beginning, Eliza. I didn't know what kind of person you were, what this place meant to you, what you would come to mean to me. She stood abruptly, pacing to the window that overlooked Main Street. Below, Cole could see townspeople gathering in small groups, their animated conversations suggesting that word of his identity had spread throughout Walnut Creek. So this was all what exactly? Some kind of game? Entertainment for a bored rich man? No. The word came out more forcefully than he had intended. Eliza, please, let me explain how this happened. She turned back to him, her arms crossed defensively across her chest. I'm listening. Cole took a deep breath, knowing that everything depended on his ability to make her understand motivations that seemed contradictory even to himself. I came to Walnut Creek to assess its potential as a shipping point for my cattle operations. It's something I do: regular travel to small towns, observe their resources and infrastructure, determine whether they're worth developing business relationships with. He watched her face carefully, seeing the hurt deepen in her eyes. I always travel quietly, without revealing my identity, because it allows me to see how places really function rather than how they perform for visiting dignitaries. So we were being evaluated. Our town, our people, our worthiness. Initially, yes, but that changed very quickly, Eliza. It changed the moment you offered me food and kindness without asking for anything in return. She made a sound of bitter disbelief. How convenient, the mysterious stranger who wins the lonely teacher's heart with his humble charade. It wasn't a charade. Cole stood as well, his own emotions finally breaking through his careful control. Do you think I planned to care about you? Do you think I wanted to fall in love with someone whose entire life's work stands in opposition to everything I represent? The words hung between them, raw and honest, and completely unguarded. Eliza's eyes widened, and Cole realized he had just admitted feelings he hadn't even fully acknowledged to himself. Love? She whispered. Yes, love. Completely, hopelessly, impossibly in love with a woman who has every reason to despise everything I am. Cole ran his hands through his hair, his careful composure finally cracking completely. Do you have any idea what it's been like, sitting here listening to you worry about problems I could solve in an afternoon? Watching you struggle with debts that amount to less than I spend on a single business dinner? Knowing that every moment I maintained this deception was a betrayal of the trust you were giving me. Eliza sank back into her chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of his revelation. If you felt that way, why didn't you just tell me? Why continue the lie? Because I was terrified, Cole admitted. Terrified that if you knew who I really was, you would see me the way everyone else sees me, as a source of wealth and influence rather than as a man. Terrified that what we had built together would become about what I could provide, rather than who I am. And what exactly did we build together, Mr. Walker? Because from where I'm sitting, it seems like it was all built on lies. The formal use of his surname cut deep, but Cole pressed on, knowing this might be his only chance to make her understand. We built something real, Eliza. Maybe it started with deception on my part, but what grew between us was genuine. The conversations we shared, the way you made me feel valued for something other than my wealth, the peace I found in your company, none of that was false. How can I believe that? How can I believe anything you've said when your entire presence here has been a fabrication? Cole reached into his coat and pulled out a letter, creased from repeated folding and unfolding. Because of this, Eliza took the letter reluctantly, recognizing her own handwriting on the envelope. It was addressed to the Territorial Education Board, one of dozens of appeals she had written over the past months. "I've been carrying this for 3 weeks," Cole said quietly. "I found it at the territorial capital when I was there on business. It was in a stack of correspondence marked for disposal letters from rural teachers that the bureaucrats didn't even bother to read." She opened the letter and began reading her own words, a passionate plea for understanding, a detailed explanation of the school's importance to the community, a desperate request for mercy and support. It was one of her most heartfelt attempts to save the school, and the territorial authorities had thrown it away without consideration. "I read that letter, Eliza, and I knew I had to meet the woman who wrote it. Someone who could express such dedication, such love for her work and her students. I had to see if such a person really existed." Tears began to flow down Eliza's cheeks as she finished reading. "So you came here to... what? Satisfy your curiosity about the foolish frontier teacher?" "I came here to understand what kind of person could write with such passion about education and service. And I stayed because I discovered that person was everything I had been looking for my entire life without knowing it." The room fell silent, except for the sound of Eliza's quiet weeping. Cole wanted desperately to comfort her, but he didn't dare presume that right after what he had revealed. "The irony," she said finally, "is that you're exactly what we need. The political influence, the financial resources, the connections to territorial authorities. You could save our school and protect our community from the very forces you represent. I know. But you're also the embodiment of everything I've spent my life fighting against. The concentration of wealth and power that treats people like commodities, that sees education as an obstacle to profit rather than a fundamental right. I know that too." She looked up at him through her tears, and Cole saw the full weight of their impossible situation reflected in her eyes. "So what happens now, Mr. Walker? Now that we both know exactly who you are and exactly what this means?" It was the question he had been dreading, the moment when all the careful self-deception had to give way to hard choices and their inevitable consequences. Cole met her gaze steadily, knowing that his answer would determine not just their future, but the future of everyone in Walnut Creek. "Now," he said quietly, "we decide whether what we built together is strong enough to survive the truth." The school's foundation stone bore the date 1855, and the simple inscription, "Knowledge is the foundation of freedom." Eliza knelt beside it in the pre-dawn darkness, her fingers tracing the carved letters, while tears she could no longer suppress fell onto the weathered granite. In 6 hours, the territorial inspectors would arrive to conduct their evaluation, and despite all of Cole's resources and influence, she had no idea whether the school would survive the day. The past 24 hours had been a whirlwind of revelations, confrontations, and impossible decisions. After Cole's identity had been exposed, the town had erupted in a mixture of hope, anger, and confusion that threatened to tear the community apart. Some residents saw his presence as a miraculous intervention, while others viewed it as manipulation and betrayal. The school board had met in emergency session 3 times, unable to reach consensus on whether to accept help from the very interests they had been fighting against. Through it all, Eliza had maintained a careful distance from Cole, needing time to process not just his deception, but the magnitude of what his true identity meant for everything she had believed about their relationship. The man who had sat at her humble table, sharing simple meals and honest conversation, commanded an empire that stretched across 3 territories. The gentle soul who had listened to her dreams and fears with such understanding was a political force powerful enough to reshape the frontier with a word. Yet even as she struggled with the betrayal, she couldn't escape the memory of the pain in his eyes when his secret was revealed, or the raw honesty in his voice when he had spoken of love. Whatever his initial motivations, she believed that his feelings for her had become genuine. The question that tormented her was whether genuine feelings could overcome the fundamental contradictions between their worlds. She heard footsteps on the wooden walkway behind her and turned to see Cole approaching through the morning mist. He carried 2 cups of coffee and moved with the careful deliberation of a man trying not to frighten away something precious and fragile. "I thought you might need this," he said quietly, offering her one of the cups. She accepted it gratefully, wrapping her fingers around the warm ceramic. "Thank you." They sat together on the schoolhouse steps, watching the sun begin to rise over the town that had become the center of their complicated universe. Walnut Creek was waking slowly, smoke beginning to curl from chimneys as families prepared for what might be the most important day in the town's history. "The inspectors will be here soon," Eliza said, breaking the silence. "Yes, Jeremiah Hutchins and his committee." Cole's voice carried a note of grim satisfaction. "They're expecting to find a failing rural school with no resources and no political support. They're not expecting to find me." "And what exactly will you do when they arrive? Wave your wealth around and demand compliance?" The bitter edge in her voice made Cole wince, but he met her gaze steadily. "I plan to do exactly what any concerned community member would do: present our legal case based on the town charter and demand fair evaluation of the school's actual performance. Using your political influence to ensure they listen. Using whatever tools are available to protect something that matters." Cole paused, studying her face in the growing light. "Eliza, I know you're struggling to trust me after what you've learned, but I need you to understand that whatever brought me to Walnut Creek originally, my reasons for staying and fighting have nothing to do with business or politics." She wanted to believe him, but the magnitude of his deception still felt like an open wound. "How can I separate your personal feelings from your public position? You're Cole Walker, the cattle baron. Everything you do carries the weight of that identity. Then let me prove that Cole Walker can use his influence for something other than personal gain." He turned to face her fully, his expression intense and determined. "Eliza, I'm prepared to publicly oppose the territorial authorities' education policies. I'm prepared to use my political connections to protect not just this school, but rural education throughout the territory. I'm prepared to risk business relationships and political alliances that have taken years to build." The scope of what he was offering took her breath away. A public stand by Cole Walker against the cattle syndicate's educational policies would send shockwaves through territorial politics and potentially inspire resistance throughout the frontier. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you risk everything for one small school?" "Because this isn't about one small school anymore. It's about the kind of territory we're building, the kind of future we're creating." Cole's voice grew stronger, more passionate. "It's about whether we'll have communities where children can learn to read and think and dream, or just economic units designed to serve corporate interests." He stood and began pacing in front of the schoolhouse, his businessman's instincts taking over as he outlined his strategy. "I've already sent telegrams to allies in the territorial legislature, warning them about the implications of closing rural schools. I've contacted newspaper editors in Denver and Cheyenne, alerting them to what's happening here. I've even reached out to Eastern philanthropists who might be interested in supporting frontier education." Eliza felt a surge of hope despite her emotional confusion. "You've done all that since yesterday?" "I've done that since 3 this morning. I may have been deceptive about my identity, but I've never been anything but sincere about my commitment to helping this community." The sound of approaching horses drew their attention to the street, where a small cavalry of riders was entering town. Even from a distance, Eliza could identify Jeremiah Hutchins by his portly figure and expensive coat. The territorial commissioners flanked him, along with several clerks, and what appeared to be a sheriff's deputy, clearly prepared for resistance. "They brought enforcement," Cole observed grimly. "They're not planning to take no for an answer. Maybe they won't have to. Maybe we're fighting a battle we can't win." Cole turned to her with an expression of fierce determination that reminded her why he had become one of the territory's most powerful men. Eliza Hart, I have seen you transform children who couldn't spell their own names into young people who debate literature and solve complex mathematical problems. I have watched you inspire parents to value education even when it meant economic sacrifice. I have witnessed you build something beautiful and vital in a place where most people see only emptiness and opportunity for exploitation. He knelt beside her on the steps, his voice dropping to an intimate whisper that somehow carried more force than his business voice had. If you can do all that with nothing but determination and love for your work, what do you think we can accomplish together with determination, love, and the resources to make real change? The words sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the morning chill. For the first time since learning his identity, she allowed herself to imagine what their partnership might look like, not just personal, but professional. Cole Walker's influence and resources, combined with her knowledge and passion for education, could transform not just Walnut Creek, but the entire territory's approach to rural schooling. Together, she asked carefully, if you'll have me, if you can forgive the deception and trust that what I feel for you is more real than anything else in my life. Before she could respond, the sound of multiple footsteps on the walkway announced the arrival of the inspection committee. Hutchins led the group, his face already set in the expression of a man prepared to deliver unpleasant news. Behind him came the other commissioners, the clerks with their ledgers and forms, and the deputy with his hand resting on his gun. "Miss Hart," Hutchins said with perfunctory politeness, "we're here to conduct the ordered inspection of this facility. I trust you have the required documentation prepared." Eliza stood, drawing herself up to her full height, with a dignity that made Cole's heart swell with pride and admiration. "Commissioner Hutchins, before we begin, I believe you should be aware that the Walnut Creek community has retained legal counsel to represent our interests in this matter." Hutchins looked around dismissively. "Legal counsel? Miss Hart, I hardly think the local lawyer in a town this size is qualified to—" "Actually," Cole said, stepping forward with a smile that was all business and no warmth, "I believe you'll find our representation quite adequate." The recognition that dawned on Hutchins' face was followed immediately by a flush of anger and what looked suspiciously like fear. "Cole Walker, I should have known you'd involve yourself in this somehow." "Commissioner Hutchins, how delightful to see you again." Cole's tone was cordial, but carried an undertone of steel that made even the deputy shift nervously. "I trust this inspection will be conducted with the same fairness and objectivity you bring to all your official duties." The battle lines were drawn, the players assembled, and the future of Walnut Creek School hanging in the balance. Eliza looked from Cole to Hutchins and back again, realizing that she was about to witness a confrontation between forces that would determine not just her own fate, but the fate of rural education throughout the territory. Whatever happened next, there would be no going back to the simple life she had known before Cole Walker arrived to change everything. The Walker Ranch deed unfolded across the schoolhouse desk like a map of empire, its legal language describing holdings that dwarfed the entire town of Walnut Creek. Cole spread the document deliberately, ensuring that Hutchins and his commissioners could see every acre, every legal description, every notation of ownership that established his position as one of the territory's most powerful landowners. "Gentlemen," Cole said with quiet authority, "before you proceed with your inspection, I think it's important that we establish exactly who has standing in this matter." Hutchins stared at the deed with the expression of a man watching his careful plans crumble before his eyes. The other commissioners shifted nervously, clearly recognizing the implications of Cole's presence, but unsure how to proceed. "Mr. Walker," Hutchins said carefully, "your property holdings are certainly impressive, but this is a matter of territorial education policy. Individual landowners, regardless of their scope of operations, don't have authority over official inspections." Cole smiled, and Eliza felt a chill at the cold calculation in his expression. This was Cole Walker, the businessman, the political force who had built an empire through careful application of power and influence. "Oh, but they do, Commissioner. You see, according to the Territorial Education Act of 1878, which I believe you helped draft. Landowner whose holdings exceed 10,000 acres within a given educational district has the right to formal consultation before significant policy changes affecting that district. He pulled another document from his coat, this one bearing the territorial seal and multiple official signatures. As you can see from this survey, the Walker Ranch encompasses exactly 14,637 acres within the Walnut Creek Educational District, which means, Commissioner Hutchins, that you are required by territorial law to formally consult with me before closing this school. The silence that followed was deafening. Eliza watched Hutchins' face cycle through confusion, recognition, and finally barely contained rage as he realized he had been outmaneuvered by his own legislation. That law was designed to give major ranchers input on educational policies that might affect their labor supply. Hutchins said through gritted teeth, it wasn't intended to allow interference with fiscal responsibility measures. Nevertheless, it's the law. Cole's voice carried the finality of a judge's gavel, and I'm formally exercising my right to consultation. Dr. Henley and several other townspeople had gathered outside the schoolhouse windows, drawn by the sound of raised voices and the unprecedented sight of territorial commissioners being challenged on their own authority. Eliza could see their faces pressed against the glass, hope and disbelief warring in their expressions. Very well, Hutchins said with visible effort to control his temper. You have 5 minutes to present your consultation. I'll need considerably more than 5 minutes. Cole replied smoothly. You see, Commissioner, I've discovered some interesting discrepancies in the documentation you've provided for this closure. He pulled out a thick folder and began laying papers across every available surface in the schoolhouse. Financial records, correspondence, legal precedents, the accumulated evidence of weeks of investigation that Cole had somehow conducted while maintaining his simple traveler facade. First, there's the matter of the debt calculation. Your office claims the school owes $347 in various obligations. However, my review of the actual vendor invoices shows a total of $218, with the remainder consisting of administrative fees and penalties that were applied retroactively without proper notification. Hutchins's face was growing redder by the moment. Mr. Walker, you had no authority to review confidential territorial records. Actually, I did. As a major landowner with consultation rights, I'm entitled to examine any documents related to educational policy decisions affecting my district. Cole's smile grew sharper. It's all spelled out quite clearly in Section 12 of that act you helped write. One of the other commissioners whispered urgently in Hutchins's ear, and Eliza saw the man's shoulders slump slightly as he realized the depth of the legal trap closing around him. Furthermore, Cole continued relentlessly, there's the matter of the town charter, which specifically protects educational institutions from closure without community consent. A charter that your office seems to have overlooked entirely in its rush to consolidate rural schools. The charter is a 40-year-old document with questionable legal standing. Actually, it was renewed and confirmed by territorial legislation just 8 years ago. Legislation that you also helped draft, Commissioner. Apparently, you've forgotten your own handiwork. Eliza watched in fascination as Cole systematically dismantled every legal justification for the school closure. This wasn't just wealth being used to buy influence. This was expert knowledge of law and policy being wielded like a surgical instrument. Whatever else Cole Walker might be, he was clearly a formidable legal strategist. But the most interesting discovery, Cole said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, was this correspondence between your office and certain private interests regarding the disposition of educational properties once they're closed. He held up a letter that made Hutchins go pale. Even from across the room, Eliza could see the letterhead of one of the major cattle syndicates. It seems that decisions about school closures aren't being made based on educational or fiscal considerations at all, but on the economic interests of private parties who would benefit from eliminating obstacles to land consolidation. The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. Hutchins looked around the room desperately, as if seeking escape from a situation that had spiraled completely beyond his control. Mr. Walker, he said finally. "You're making very serious allegations without proper evidence." "Oh, I have evidence, Commissioner. Extensive evidence. The question is whether we resolve this matter here and now, or whether I take it to the territorial legislature, the newspapers, and the federal authorities who oversee territorial governance." The threat was clear, and Eliza could see that Hutchins understood exactly what Cole was offering: capitulation or destruction. Eliza's handwritten letter lay unfolded on the desk between them, its carefully scripted words carrying more weight than all of Cole's legal documents and political maneuvering. She had written it during the tense standoff with Commissioner Hutchins, while Cole had systematically dismantled the case for closing the school. Now, as the territorial officials retreated to consider their options, she held the letter that would determine not just the school's future, but the course of her own heart. "Cole," she said softly, using his first name for the first time since learning his true identity. "Before you read this, I need you to understand something." He looked up from organizing the legal papers that had secured their victory, his eyes searching her face for some indication of what she had decided about them, about the impossible situation their relationship had become. "What you did today, the way you fought for this school, for this community, it showed me who you really are beneath all the wealth and power and political influence." She paused, gathering courage for words that would change everything between them. "But it also showed me how different our worlds truly are." Cole's expression grew guarded. "Eliza, if this is about the deception, it's not about the deception anymore. Or not only about that." She picked up the letter, her fingers trembling slightly. "It's about what happens now. What happens when you return to your empire and your responsibilities, and I remain here with mine. What if I told you that I don't want to return to that life? What if I said I'd rather stay here in Walnut Creek and build something different?" The question she had been hoping for and dreading in equal measure. Eliza felt tears gathering in her eyes as she considered all the reasons why such a choice would be impossible, impractical, ultimately destructive to everything they both valued. "And what if I told you that I love you too much to let you make that sacrifice?" The words hung between them like a bridge across an impossible chasm. Cole's face transformed with a mixture of joy and anguish as he processed what she had admitted and what she was about to take away. "You love me?" "Completely, hopelessly, despite every rational reason why I shouldn't." Eliza's voice broke slightly. "I love the man who shared simple meals with me and listened to my dreams. I love the gentle soul who comforted me when everything seemed lost. I even love the powerful force who fought for our school today with such passion and skill." "Then why?" "Because love isn't enough, Cole. Not when it requires one of us to abandon everything we are." She held up the letter, her hands steadier now that the decision was made. "This is my resignation from the Walnut Creek School, effective at the end of the academic year." Cole stared at her in shock. "Eliza, no, you can't leave. This place needs you. These children need you. These children need a school that can survive and thrive without depending on one person's dedication or one man's wealth and influence. What you've accomplished today proves that Walnut Creek can have that kind of school, but not if I remain as a symbol of the old way of doing things." She moved to stand beside him, close enough to feel the warmth of his presence, but careful not to touch him, knowing that physical contact would undermine her resolve. "Cole, you've shown this community that they can fight for their values and win. You've given them legal tools and political knowledge they never had before. But you've also shown them that they can't depend on the kindness of Stranger 7, wealthy, powerful Stranger Stowe, solve their fundamental problems. So you're leaving to prove a point about independence." "I'm leaving because I love you too much to trap you in a life that would ultimately diminish you, and because I love this community too much to let it become dependent on our personal relationship." Eliza turned to face the window, looking out at the town that had been her home for 30 years. "The school will get a new teacher, one who comes without the complications of my history here. The community will learn to advocate for itself using the tools you've given them. And you will return to your empire and use your influence to protect rural education throughout the territory." "And us? What about us?" The pain in his voice nearly broke her resolve, but she forced herself to continue. "We'll have the memory of something beautiful and real, something that mattered more than either of us expected. We'll know that we found love in an impossible place and time, and that love inspired us both to become better than we were." Cole was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of decisions that would reshape both their lives. "Eliza, what if there were another way? What if we could build something together that didn't require either of us to sacrifice our essential selves?" She turned back to him, seeing in his eyes the beginning of an idea that might change everything they thought they knew about their impossible situation. "What do you mean?" "I mean, what if Cole Walker, cattle baron, decided to become Cole Walker, advocate for frontier education? What if instead of choosing between love and duty, we found a way to serve both?" The possibility hung between them like dawn breaking over the prairie, full of promise and fraught with uncertainty. The new school bell's clear bronze voice rang across Walnut Creek on a crisp October morning, calling children to learning just as it had for the past 6 months since Cole and Eliza's wedding. The bell itself was a marvel of craftsmanship, cast in Denver, according to Eliza's specifications, but funded by Cole's resources, a perfect symbol of their partnership and the new chapter their union had written for the town. Eliza stood in the doorway of the expanded schoolhouse, watching her students hurry down Main Street with their slates and primers. The building had grown over the summer, with 2 additional rooms that allowed for more advanced instruction and a proper library that had become the pride of the territory. But more than the physical improvements, it was the transformation in the children themselves that filled her with the deepest satisfaction. Young Timothy Patterson, now 13, was working through algebraic equations that would have challenged students twice his age. Sarah Caldwell had become an accomplished reader who devoured every book in the growing library. Most remarkably, 3 of her older students had received scholarships to attend the Territorial Teachers College's scholarships funded by the Cole and Eliza Walker Educational Foundation, which had quietly begun supporting rural education throughout the Wyoming Territory. Mrs. Walker, called Mary Catherine O'Brien, now serving as the school's assistant teacher, "The delegation from Cheyenne has arrived. They're quite eager to see our classroom innovations." Eliza nodded, smoothing her skirts as she prepared to receive the 3rd group of education officials who had visited Walnut Creek that month. Word of their success had spread throughout the territory, and the small town had become an unlikely model for rural education reform. Cole's influence had opened doors, but it was the demonstrable success of their methods that kept those doors open. She found Cole in the library, deep in conversation with Superintendent Morrison from the Territorial Education Department. 6 months of marriage had only deepened her appreciation for her husband's mind. His ability to discuss educational philosophy with the same insight he brought to cattle ranching and territorial politics continued to surprise visitors, who expected a wealthy man's dilettante interest in his wife's work. "The reading comprehension improvements are remarkable," Morrison was saying, examining the test scores that documented their students' progress. "How do you account for such dramatic results in such a short time?" "Individual attention combined with high expectations," Eliza replied, joining the conversation. "When children know that someone believes in their potential, they rise to meet that belief. And adequate resources don't hurt," Cole added with a smile. "But the resources only work when they're guided by genuine understanding of how children learn. My wife has that understanding in abundance." The easy partnership in his voice, the way he deferred to her expertise while contributing his own insights, still filled Eliza with wonder. Their marriage had solved the seemingly impossible problem of their different worlds by creating a new world that drew from both their strengths. Cole had indeed transformed himself from simple cattle baron to advocate for frontier education, but not at the cost of his business acumen or political influence. Instead, he had found ways to align his various interests, using his ranching operations to demonstrate that educated workers were more productive. his political connections to advocate for increased educational funding, and his wealth to support innovations that proved their worth through results rather than rhetoric. The afternoon brought the monthly meeting of the Walker Foundation's Board of Directors, held in the schoolhouse's main room after classes ended. The board included teachers from across the territory, local business leaders and territorial officials who had once opposed rural education but now championed it as essential to regional development. "The Laramie project is exceeding all expectations," reported Dr. Henley, who had become the Foundation's medical advisor. 3 new schools opened this quarter, and enrollment is up 30% territory-wide. "The teacher training program is showing similar success," added Samuel Morrison, whose general store had become the unofficial headquarters for educational supply distribution. "We now have 43 certified teachers working in communities that previously had no formal education." Eliza listened to the reports with deep satisfaction, knowing that each statistic represented children whose lives had been changed, families whose aspirations had been lifted, communities whose futures had been transformed. The work that had begun with her desperate attempt to save one small school had grown into a movement that was reshaping the territory's approach to education. As the meeting concluded and the board members departed, Cole and Eliza found themselves alone in the schoolhouse where their unlikely love story had begun. The evening light streaming through the windows reminded them both of those first tentative conversations over simple meals when neither had imagined the future they were building together. "Do you ever miss it?" Eliza asked, settling into the chair where Cole had sat during those early evenings. "The simplicity of who you were when you were just Cole the traveler?" "Never," Cole replied without hesitation. "That man was searching for something he couldn't name. This man has found it." He pulled her to her feet and into his arms, the gesture as natural now as it had been startling during their courtship. "Besides, I've learned that the best kind of wealth isn't what you accumulate, it's what you build with someone you love." Outside, the sounds of Walnut Creek settling into evening provided a familiar backdrop to their contentment. The town had grown and prospered, attracting new families drawn by its reputation for excellent schools and enlightened leadership. The cattle syndicates that had once threatened the community's existence now competed for contracts with ranchers who valued education and treated their workers fairly. As they prepared to leave the schoolhouse for their own homier, modest house, Cole had built near the school rather than the mansion his wealth could have afforded. Eliza paused to touch the foundation stone that had witnessed her darkest moments and greatest triumphs. "Knowledge is the foundation of freedom," she read aloud, as she had countless times over the years. "And love," Cole added, "is the foundation of everything else." Hand in hand, they walked into the gathering dusk, their partnership a testament to the truth that the greatest transformations come not from changing who we are, but from finding someone who inspires us to become who we were always meant to be. Behind them, the schoolhouse stood ready for another day of teaching and learning, its windows glowing with the promise that knowledge and love, properly nurtured, could indeed change the world.